Today's conversation asks the question, why does the American city remain so spatially and racially divided decades after the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement? Practices like redlining, restrictive covenants based on race, segregated public transit, and literacy tests for voting have all been abolished, at least on paper and in theory. However, events since spring 2020 have returned to the public consciousness a reality that had always been obvious to millions of Americans living in poverty and in urban areas. That this country remains divided, and that the racism of Jim Crow, rather than disappearing, has taken new forms. Drawing from the perspectives of architecture, planning, sociology, and history, this conversation considers the evidence for how the American city and suburb, specifically Detroit, remain spatially divided, and what steps must be taken to fulfill the dream of an egalitarian metropolis. Okay, I'm glad to see everyone here, recognize a few neighbors and friends. So we'll just get started with introductions to our three speakers. So I'm Myles Zhang. I'm a PhD student in history and architecture at Taubman College at the University of Michigan. And so we have three panelists today. We have Robert Fishman, who welcomed me to Taubman College last year as my dissertation co-thesis supervisor. Professor Fishman is a professor of architecture and urban planning. He's an internationally recognized expert in urban history, urban policy, and planning. He's authored several books, such as Bourgeois Utopias, The Rise and Fall of Suburbia, and some of his and our current work funded through the Michigan Mellon Project. It works for the egalitarian metropolis and examines the divided landscape of Detroit through the lens of race, redlining, and planning. And our second speaker is Professor Karyn Lacey, and she is an associate professor of sociology and African American studies. Her work focuses on race relations, residential segregation, parental socialization, social stratification, and most of all, suburban culture. And her book, Blue Chip Black, examines experience of middle and upper middle class Blacks who had moved to suburbia. And our final speaker is LaDale Windling. You might have seen some of his work from the Mapping Inequality website that tracked the geography of redlining and created interactive maps online for the general public, featured by a lot of news outlets like the New York Times, The Atlantic, and National Public Radio. And Professor Windling is an associate professor of history. He's an alum of our PhD program. And his research and teaching explore urban history and political history and how space, architecture, geography, and politics are all reflections of the built environment. So we'll just get started. I think we'll probably lay out a few terms in the beginning and then kind of launch into what is racializing space and what is its legacy on the contemporary built environment. So I'll just start with a question for Professor LaDale Windling, which is in 4 or 5 minutes, if you could go through what is redlining and what is its impact on urban and suburban spaces today?
So first of all, let me say thank you so much for having me. And I'll say redlining is both a historical phenomenon and a present day practice. And so Myles mentioned the project that I've worked on and kind of current focus of my research on redlining, and that as an example, maybe the classic example of the mix of finance and public policy in kind of development of the built environment, especially in real estate. And so this era that my project Mapping Inequality examines or illuminates builds, first of all, on the work of many, many historians, who came before me and kind of encountered these federal programs as well as this kind of like public-private partnership. But in sum, the historical redlining is a set of programs that came about in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. First the Hoover administration and then the Roosevelt administration established agencies to kind of help deal with the real estate and home finance crisis that was a key part of the Great Depression. And these national agencies, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Home Loan Bank, and the Federal Housing Administration, worked to draw upon, in fact, they were staffed by leading private real estate officials, like the ideas that had been circulating in the 1920s in the real estate industry and the building and loan industry, to first kind of clear the bank balances or clear the balance sheets of banking institutions, keep homeowners in their homes, and to restructure a system that would minimize risk and that was in many ways based upon racial discrimination and as well as kind of ethnic and class stratification. And this restructuring by the federal government basically created a new system of home finance, and one that still kind of predominates today. It was initiated in the 1930s, dramatically different from the system that preceded it. And so with this, these ideas, as I said, kind of had been in circulation, essentially that racial mixing was not good for property values and that the highest and best way of evaluating was with the white property owner as the kind of model and like the first priority, right? And with the power and the resources of the federal government, created both a kind of geographic like set of maps, but those are really visual indices, ways of visually representing the kind of values that economists and realtors had been kind of working on in loose coalition throughout the 1920s, and then put like billions of dollars in the full faith and credit of the federal government behind those values. And so, one of the key examples of this is that institutionalized redlining, and whether it be refinancing by the homeowners loan corporation or whether it be mortgage finance by mortgage insurance by FHA, was built on a foundation of racially restrictive covenants, right? Racial restrictions and development restrictions were one of the key elements that appraisers and public officials, valued and prioritized in building kind of a stable and durable system of home finance and real estate development. This kind of system continued on, right, throughout the 1930s, 1940s, through much of the 20th century. And there are still legacy elements today, even long after the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But I'll say this kind of like intentional denial of investment and particularly home finance continues today in the private real estate sector. There's investigations, journalistic inquiries that illustrate that redlining is demonstrably going on in more than 60 metropolitan areas across the country. And in many cases, like this is without the active involvement of the federal government, as there had been in the 30s, 40s, and so forth, but is part and parcel to that kind of that system that was restructured in the 1930s and 1940s. And so mortgage insurance and the denial of mortgage insurance is one aspect. Another is racially restrictive covenants in the first half of the 20th century, which kind of developed hand in hand or hand in glove with land use zoning. And then the practice of real estate appraisal. All of these ideas kind of gained currency at the same time, and then several of them endure in one form or another to this day. So we'll say maybe that's adequate for an explanation of redlining, and I'll fundamentally say that finance and the public policy that guides land development, architectural practice, planning, and so forth, those are fundamental. In many cases, like finance and like zoning codes and real estate appraisal are like much less visible, much less like sexy than the brick and mortar, kind of buildings that you can see, but that kind of invisibility is in part what gives these kind of legacy discriminatory mechanisms and practices some of their enduring power.
Thank you. So 2 points that from your observation really spoke to me. The first is about the long legacy of redlining and how it continues to affect our cities today through similar redlining practices. And the second is the ways in which these policies seem to influence physically zoning in the built environment, which I think perfectly transitions to Professor Lacey's work, which I'd like to ask her, which is what other policies from government and practices from realtors and residents keep suburbs spatially and racially divided? Because redlining, at least in theory, has been abolished. So what's still the problem here? What other new practices are there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Myles. So there are both illegal and legal practices that have helped to establish residential segregation and to perpetuate it in American cities. And Dale provided a really good overview of redlining and restrictive covenants. I would just add that their impact is still felt today in another way, which is because Black people were denied access to FHA loans, and lenders, their mortgages would not be insured by the FHA, and denied access to suburbs that took off beginning in the late 1940s with the first Levittown. It means that over all those decades, Black people have not been able to accumulate wealth from home equity at the same rate that white families have. So, we talk about the wage gap today, but we often don't talk about the government's role in helping to create that gap. So if we fast forward to today, some of the other practices that are illegal are realtors showing more homes to white home seekers than they do to Black home seekers, taking Black people only to Black neighborhoods, not showing them integrated or white neighborhoods, providing white home seekers with more information about properties than they do Black home seekers. So a lot of those discriminatory practices are still operative today, even though we have had a Fair Housing Act for all of these decades now. The government has been focused primarily on the kinds of illegal practices that realtors and lenders are involved in, but there's also quite a bit of segregation that is perpetuated through legal practices, right? And by that I mean practices that the government can't really easily regulate. So one of those is the neighborhood preferences that different racial groups express when surveyed. And Ren Farley, who's now a professor emeritus in sociology here at Michigan, has done a lot of that work in the city of Detroit and its suburbs. What he did was to take a set of cards that had his version of a neighborhood on them. So I think there were maybe 12 houses that were printed on a card. And he would interview whites and say to them, the first card has one Black family, would you live here? And yes, he'd give them the second card, which would have two Black families, would you live here? And he continued to give them the cards until they said, absolutely not, I don't want to live around that many Black people. And the card was also interesting because he would move the respondents' proximity to the Black homeowner around. So would it matter to you if there's one Black family in the neighborhood, if they live right next door to you versus if they live way on the other end of the neighborhood? And through that process, he was able to determine how willing white people were to live in neighborhoods with Black people. In 1976, he found that the majority of white people would move out if the neighborhood contained more than 30% Black residents. They'd say they were not willing to live there. By 1992, when he went back to talk to respondents, 42% of the sample said they would be willing to live in a neighborhood that was 30% Black. So that was some improvement, which he attributed primarily to an influx of younger white people in neighborhoods in Detroit, and also college educated people who were pushing up the tolerance level for integrated neighborhoods. So we have seen some improvement there. And then I would say another practice that is not illegal, but is certainly consequential, is something that I've observed in my own work, which is white avoidance. I studied Prince George's County, which is a predominantly Black suburb outside of DC. And the residents there, I studied two communities in PG. One was what I call core middle class. The other was what I call elite middle class or upper middle class. Some of the residents talked about how when the kids from their child's private school, because a lot of the kids went to exclusive private schools in DC, came out to visit them, they were shocked that there was a decent neighborhood in PG County, that they weren't going to be shot or have their car stolen in PG County. So an unwillingness to even drive across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge to see what's over there, right, also perpetuates segregation. For one thing, if you live in a Black neighborhood, your house is not going to sell as quickly on average because white people are not going to come and look at it. They're only going to look in neighborhoods that are predominantly white, in part because that's where their realtors take them. And the other issue is, are you willing to take that chance as a homeowner if you know that your property values are not going to increase as quickly as they might if you lived across the river in Fairfax County? So I think those are two of the ways that segregation persists that legislation can't really address. You can't legislate that people like each other, or legislate that people make their kids play with each other on a play date in a Black suburb. Those aren't things that you can address through legislation. I think there are other ways that we could begin to tackle those issues, but it's not something that Congress can do.
Thank you. I think the leading question that I have for Professor Fishman is, so we see how redlining and racial segregation, these are legal policies and political policies and planning policies. The question I have for you, Professor Fishman, is how does this implicate the work of architects? How does this look like in the built environment, in the design of layout of homes or specific neighborhoods?
Okay, well, first, Myles, thank you so much for not only for organizing this particular panel, but also for all the work that you've done for the Egalitarian Metropolis Project, for the Racializing Space Project, and so on. I had actually intended, I thought you were going to ask me a different question, and that's the question that I will answer.
Yes, well, what is racializing space?
Which is what is racializing space? And first of all, I want to say that the field has been particularly aided, that there's a book that really sums up the previous research and also has somehow managed to reach a much wider audience. And that, of course, is this one, Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I should say to the doctoral students here that one of the most useful elements of a book like this is that it can be used as a starting point for revisionism, for disagreeing. And it's in this spirit that I want to talk about it because it is so influential. Now, Rothstein, blessedly, has a very clear interpretation of racializing space, which is right in his subtitle, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And he continually returns to this essentially legal framework of state action versus private choice. And basically his interpretation, which I think is the interpretation of the field, is that the history of racializing space, that the dominant interpretation, we should look to state action as opposed to private choice. Those are the real issues. And as I said, I want to critique this briefly, starting with Exhibit A, which is redlining. And Dale has given us a really in-depth picture of it, but I have to, in the spirit of revisionism, to disagree with his interpretation, which is really the field's interpretation. I think the field has emphasized, as he did, the way in which redlining established certain patterns that continue to this day. I see redlining much more, as he said, as coming out of the interwar period, as looking backward rather than forward, in the sense that it was all about drawing lines of segregation that were assumed would last as as the lines that have been drawn in the years after the First World War really did persist through the interwar period. So there's an emphasis in how these put forward. But if you look at the history, especially the history of Detroit, what you see is that the lines don't control. Instead, the color line is continuously being broken, the opposition is being overcome. Black population is moving through formerly working class areas, formerly middle class areas, what segregatists call defended neighborhoods and undefended neighborhoods. In other words, if the project of government was to segregate the cities, they did a very poor job of it. The barriers are continuously being overcome. So the question I ask from that in terms of racializing space is, given this movement of Black population through a great city like Detroit, why didn't we wind up with a wide range of neighborhoods, some of which would be almost all Black, some of which would be almost all white, but many of which would be integrated to a greater or lesser degree? Why doesn't that happen? And in my opinion, you have to turn to the issue of private choice, as I think Karyn just did. And I'm glad that she brought up Reynolds Farley's critical research in this. Because one thing that's striking to me and very disappointing to me is that the Rothstein book completely ignores this line of research. And not just Farley, but there is out there a very strong mathematical model based on the idea of private choice, drawn up in the 1950s and 1960s, precisely to account for why does a series of uncoordinated private choices by homeowners with very, very different levels of racial prejudice, why does this result, nevertheless, in long-term and near total segregation? And this theory is the one we know as the tipping point theory, which Malcolm Gladwell has tried to apply to everything, but in fact, interestingly enough, was formulated precisely to explain how a series of private choices with regard to residential segregation could wind up having effects that virtually no one predicted or wished for. So what this means, and I think this is the great value of Reynolds Farley's research, of Karyn's research really, is that in this project of racializing space, where I'd like to see it go is to look very carefully at what's actually happening in this period when the color line is broken, when there are a whole lot of different possible outcomes, when no one really knows that the result is going to be a total resegregation. And to kind of look at it, especially through the experience of the new Black homeowners who have moved in with the hope of being real neighbors, with the expectation of being part of this neighborhood, of contributing to this neighborhood, and discovered that they've set in motion involuntarily this process of the tipping point. To ask what happens at the level of the block, at the level of the neighborhood. And it's difficult because private choices by definition are private. They don't enter the public record the way public actions do. But nevertheless, that to me is the real challenge of understanding at least what happened in a city like Detroit. The color line is broken again and again and again, and yet the result is a resegregation rather than integration. This is what I mean, at least, by the racialization of space.
Thank you, Professor Fishman. It seems one of the real challenges here is that balance between public policy and private choice. It also seems to me that many aspects of private choice are impacted by government policies. I think of the case of Milliken v. Bradley in the 1970s, where Justice Brennan writes for the Supreme Court that blacks and whites, so long accustomed by government policy to be separated, will only continue to enforce that segregation as individual choices after those policies are abolished. How can we expect otherwise? The other question that I'd like to follow up with, which is, you kind of cite places where redlining seems to be kind of ineffective as a policy to have segregated the built environment. We also have other examples of things like highways that encircled and divided specific communities, polluting industries, and urban renewal projects concentrated in areas of predominantly immigrants and non-white peoples. But the other question I have for you, both for Robert and LaDale, is what other and less obvious examples are there of ways architects, planners, and developers use the built environment to segregate space? Every day in the media, you read about redlining and highways carved through the South Bronx and other communities. But what other ways are there? What other kinds of maybe more subtle ways that might segregate the environment, but actually do not appear to simply in how they're worded? Because redlining is explicitly obvious. I think that's kind of explains part of the appeal of this as a visual, as an index, as LaDale cites, to kind of explain what's happening. What other kinds of tactics go along with redlining?
Well, I would say to acknowledge the interaction of public action and private action. I would in some ways say it's like difficult, if not impossible, to like separate them. To separate them and say the result of this outcome is only due to public action or public policy, and like the result of this is only due to private, right? Because as you say, Myles, there are underlying policy structures that shape and subsidize and facilitate like people's choices, and in fact like limit, right, like the bounds of what we would even envision is possible for where to invest in like real estate, or where to buy a home, or how we could finance that with a bank. And so that kind of interaction between public and private, I think, is essential for getting at that kind of tension and that boundary point. One that I would say that I encounter with ever greater relevance in my current research is land use zoning. And when I did a MUP at Michigan at the same time I was doing my PhD, land use zoning and low density single family detached residential zoning was the bête noire of the planning cohorts, in part because of the way it kind of imposes auto dependency. But now I kind of realize that basically land use zoning and racially restrictive covenants like grew up together, right? Essentially that there was, in the 19-teens, there had been an effort to create state-sanctioned segregationist zoning ordinances that were ruled unconstitutional in 1917. And so basically these two things were split apart. And so racially restrictive covenants and land use zoning, in fact, were each independently heard by the Supreme Court in 1926, and within a week of each other. And then as separate actions, they both passed and were ratified by the Supreme Court. Racially restrictive covenants later were struck down in Shelley versus Kramer, but Euclid versus Ambler Realty, in fact, before reaching the Supreme Court, was struck down at the appellate court level as discriminatory, just as the kind of segregation and ordinances of the 19-teens had been. The Supreme Court decided otherwise, but the point is that these two means of organizing residential real estate within cities went hand in hand. And when racially restrictive covenants were struck down, land use zoning, as being ostensibly race neutral, was allowed to continue, and it still kind of dominates to this day. And so like something is simple, and I think the planning students of my youth were right that the zoning code is one of the most fundamental and tedious kind of documents for understanding both the values of a community and how those maybe explicitly racial origins can be bureaucratized and made to seem race neutral over the course of the 20th century. And then real estate appraisal. There's a sociologist who just had a book come out called Race Brokers, who illustrates that private real estate appraisers, in like doing their jobs in service of banks and mortgage companies, basically are following the playbook established decades before. So fully private action, private institutions with extremely little government regulation can determine whether a family, Black or white, can refinance their home, whether they can pull out equity to pay for their kids' college education, for example, to make expansions or investments, renovations, or needed maintenance on the house that they already own. And we've seen a number of cases as well as lawsuits illustrating that African Americans suffer from low appraisal values. Basically, until they quote unquote whitewash their homes, exactly comparable homes, exactly comparable families or considerations, except whether the homeowner is identified as Black or white, results in hundreds of thousands of dollars lower values that they have access for withdrawing for equity to invest in other things. And these are private actions. And so whether someone decides, do I want to live in this neighborhood where my home and my investment may not appreciate over time, that's a private action, but it's shaped by some of these enduring legacy institutionalization into public policy of what had been already existing private prejudice and biases and so forth.
Yeah, I want to use my comment essentially to pass the baton to Karyn, because so much of her research is so much more directly relevant. Just a couple comments though on Dale, that yes, state action and private choice really are intermixed. My point was really that these are terms that come out of legal studies. And as historians, I think we've gone way too far in separating the two and emphasizing state action. Now, one issue where state action, or the state, quote unquote, does seem so striking, especially in the Detroit metro area, is the impact of 8 Mile, of that city-suburban boundary, which is, again, I think something that has to be explained and teased out. Because in a lot of the political science literature, you read that suburban governments are weak, that they're divided, and so on. But what an amazing impact that line has had for so long. And again, I think the analysis, and as I say, I'll pass the baton to Karyn on this, but it comes down to these interactions, the way in which the powers of home rule, that's a quote unquote home rule, that suburban municipalities have, so intertwine with these real estate practices, with private choices and so on, to create something so much more powerful than either state action or private choice would ever seem to yield.
I'm really enjoying this panel. Part of the beauty of tackling a pressing problem from all these different perspectives is really interesting. Sociologists would argue that people's housing choices are rooted in a broader social structure. So the average person tends to think if you want to buy a house, you get a realtor, you go out, look at houses, and then you make a decision. But studies like the HUD audit studies that have been conducted by the Department of Housing and Urban Development really make clear that Black home seekers and white seekers are having a different experience in the housing market. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with audit studies, but essentially these studies, the principal investigator recruits a sample of Black and white people in the context of housing discrimination. They've also been used in pinpoint employment discrimination. But in housing, they're recruited and they're assigned fictional identities with the same financial background, educational background, et cetera. And then they're sent out to look for houses or to rent apartments. And if the Black person goes in and is told, for example, that the house that they're interested in is not available, but then the white person goes in and the realtor says, yeah, let me show you the house. That's an example of a disparate experience in the housing market. And it's the way that federal government has been able to pinpoint how much discrimination still exists in the housing market. So that's one example of how realtors and lenders are actually shaping the housing decisions of home seekers by determining which neighborhoods they're going to take them to, how much information they're going to provide them with, how helpful are lenders in their efforts to secure the housing. We don't talk much about the role of developers, which is something that really was an important factor in my work in the suburbs of DC when I was writing Blue Chip Black. I mean, there was a time when we focused a lot on Levittown and the Levitt brothers. They were incredibly influential developers. They built the largest subdivision completed by only one builder in 1947 on Long Island. And they were innovative in that they introduced the concept of the model home, where you start a subdivision and then you complete one house and furnish it. People come in and look at that house, not the one they're actually going to buy, and make a decision. And model homes are the norm in suburbs today. They introduced cookie cutter suburbs, where now people think it's sort of normal to live in a suburb where everybody's house looks the same, except maybe the door is painted a different color. They introduced neighborhood covenants. Everybody has to have grass that's the same length. You can't hang a clothesline in your backyard. You can't erect a fence. So there are all these ways that they were influential in the housing market that are still in practice today, but they refused to use their influence to tackle residential segregation. In fact, William Levitt, one of the brothers, said, we can solve a housing problem, or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two. So they refused to rent to Black home seekers or to encourage their residents to consider having a Black neighbor. And so in that case, I don't think that's really an example of free choice, because the home seekers in Levittown were forced to sign the restrictive covenant. It was embedded in their deed. If they wanted to live in Levittown, they had to buy into white homogeneity. And certainly Black people who were denied an opportunity to live there were forced to move to other sections of the city. But also in my own book, Blue Chip Black, there was an upscale community that I call Sherwood Park that I learned started out, the developers intended to market the community to white home seekers. And initially that's who bought in. The first 4 families who bought houses there were white. But then something interesting happened. Upper middle class Black people started driving by and saying, what is that? What's going on over there? They drove in and started saying, what's happening? How can we get a house here? And then the developers switched out the sales staff. What had been a completely white sales staff was switched out to a completely Black sales staff. And everyone that I talked to told me that was a signal of what the developers were doing, that they had changed their minds about who they wanted the home seekers to be. One person told me, you don't hire a Black sales staff to sell to white people. So in doing so, the developers were signaling, we've given up on our initial conception of what they thought this community would be, but now that it's going to be a Black community, we can see that. And sure enough, the majority of the people who moved in later were Black people. And some of the white people who bought in initially moved out because they saw the neighborhood tipping towards Black and didn't want to live there. So that's an example of developers shaping the neighborhood choices of residents in ways that we might not anticipate.
Your comment is very interesting, because I was reading about Levittown, New Jersey the other day, and you read that now it's an 80% African-American community with a mosque, which speaks to how these suburbs change. And then I hear Professor Fishman's comment about how the car lines are constantly being broken. At the same time, segregation persists. And So I think that I don't want to kind of fall into this fatalism that the more things change, the more they stay the same, that some things do change. And I hope that the work of historians can kind of look at history and maybe chart a path forward of how to reconcile this past. Which I think leads me to my next question, which is the idea of how have the geography and demographics of suburbia changed since the civil rights movement? For instance, I read Professor Fishman's book on bourgeois utopias and the concluding chapter about the technoburb, the idea that the suburbs have picked up many of the responsibilities of cities. And so this is kind of a question for all of you. What has changed since 1965 and what hasn't changed? We know a lot about what hasn't changed.
To me, the major change has been what you might call, paradoxically, the urbanization of the suburbs. Their ability, even at a low density, to take on the functions which still in the 1960s were seen as necessarily urban. The downtown functions of office and big retail, the industrial parks, and so on. And increasingly, as Karyn has shown and spoken about, they are taking on in different forms something like the cliche of the diverse city, and the uniform white bread suburb just doesn't apply anymore. And we've seen many immigrant groups settling directly in suburbs rather than in cities, a movement of Black population out of central cities, not least Detroit, to the quote unquote suburbs. The suburbs have become part of the metro area in a way that they never really wished or intended. And I hope this is a hopeful thing, that it opens up possibilities both for the city and for the suburb.
Yeah, I agree. Myles knows that I've written a piece for the Annual Review of Sociology on these demographic shifts in the suburbs. I would add that in addition to the trends that Robert just described, an influx of immigrants in the suburbs, an influx of Black people, middle-class Black people in particular, in the suburbs, is also the rising class polarization in the suburbs. The average person, I would say, doesn't know, and I'd include Trump here, either doesn't know or has chosen to ignore that the majority of immigrants live in the suburbs now. The majority of poor people live in the suburbs now. The majority of Black people live in the suburbs now. But the suburbs are not communities that were constructed for poor people. They're constructed for people who have cars. So if you're a person who can't afford a car and you need public transportation to get around, it's going to be very difficult to live in the suburbs. There's an article about Atlanta a few years back where a woman was interviewed who lived in the suburbs, but what would normally take someone who lived there 20-minute drive to get to work took her 2 hours on the bus. And so there was a time when spatial mismatch referred to all the jobs being in one place and poor people being in another place. And now the spatial mismatch is within the suburbs itself. Poor people live in communities where shopping malls and businesses are, but they can't easily get to them because they don't have cars. So I think that's something that we have to be attentive to going forward, and a problem that's only going to be exacerbated over time.
That's interesting. It transfers, I think, to my question for LaDale, which is this idea that you have a divided suburb and you have transportation policies that might accelerate a divided suburb. As a planner, how do you go about proving the intent of these policies? Bus line that never reaches a shopping mall or makes it difficult to get from places of work in the city center to places of employment or otherwise. Is it just a correlation? Do you establish causation? Because one of the strengths, it seems, of the redlining policy is just how blatant it is. You read the documents and it explicitly says this neighborhood is at risk of becoming Black. Let's put it in the red district. The visual record of that. So how do you go about proving it with things that might be more ambiguous but still have a racial intent, like a highway location or a specific public housing project or neighborhood that's zoned for single family houses within a certain price range or a bus line that only goes to certain locations?
So I'll say I've had the luxury, even when I've worked with lawyers, of not having to think of myself as proving something, because that can be a high but also a vague burden. whether you're convincing a judge or whether you're convincing a jury in some fashion, who knows what it takes to like prove something. But I'll say, like the kind of work that I try to do, civically engaged, public-facing work that educates both the public, journalists, and policymakers, provides evidence or makes the case, right? Like you're right, there's few documents that we might encounter or programs that we might be able to talk about that are as kind of clear and blatant as like the work of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. But we can illustrate and make the case about whether it be the kind of, this is a particular, I think, beauty of the work of historians or historically oriented work, is to illustrate kind of the legacy and the endurance, as well as the transformation of unequal or discriminatory policies or practices over time. And, like I said, I work on a project now on racially restrictive covenants. And those have been unenforceable since 1948. But understanding the stories of the development of racially restrictive covenants and kind of illustrating some of the enduring patterns that were established by racially restrictive covenants has valence. Confronting people or allowing them to confront primary source documents, even ones that have been buried in like county land recorders' offices for decades, still can have meaning today in changing people's minds or illuminating, turning a light on over their head to a situation that they had never seen before, or whether it be the routing of interstate highways through neighborhoods. And in that sense, denaturalizing these kinds of processes or denaturalizing the world that we inherit from the earlier generation, the world that we see around us, that someone had to decide, someone had to make it, someone had to orchestrate those changes, and just illustrating that process.
Thank you. Your research seems to validate the work of historians and speak to the value of studying history to inform the present day. As an example, I was thinking of my own community in Newark and how developers put up these towers that are all apartments. And I asked the developers, why do you do this? And they said that this is what the people in the community prefer, which kind of sidelines the history that you have a majority Black city and they're all apartments. Well, maybe they couldn't have, we're lucky to have the housing market. And so it seems to speak to this earlier point of the separation of private choice and public policies, when you read to which public policy seems to look like private choices. And which leads, I think, to, which is my concluding question, the idea of where do we go from here? Your question, LaDale, spoke to that partially about history as a liberatory practice. But I'm also curious to hear from Professor Lacey and Professor Fishman. So what is the value of studying racializing space? And how can that chart a path forward in terms of coming up with public policies that will start to denaturalize these assumptions built into our cities, such as things like public school policies, zoning changes. So what specific kinds of changes can we implement on the built environment based on your study of history?
Well, let me say I do appreciate, what, and very much agree with what Dale said, about essentially historicizing what people simply take for granted. The one thing I would add, and two things. First of all, I am concerned that this deep dive into the racializing space of Detroit will just introduce a whole lot of negative and depressing stories and outcomes. But the thing that I do admire about the Rothstein book is that he gives full weight, you might say almost too much weight, to the resistors, to the people who tried for other outcomes. And to me, that is the essence of, really understanding history, not as the history of the winners, but as a contested process that hasn't ended, and that we can learn from what people were trying to do. In many ways, the people who were struggling for integration in the Detroit neighborhoods were ahead of us rather than behind us. They lead us forward. and that it's our responsibility to somehow follow their lead.
Well, the suburbs have been constructed as a reward for having worked hard and climbed up the class ladder, right? And for ethnic groups having given up your ethnic identity to become a part of the American mainstream. But now we're barreling toward a different America. Demographers predict that by 2042, the white population will shrink from 60% of the population today, all the way down to 46% of the population in roughly 20 years. So that's going to be a different America than the one that we're sitting in right now. And it's going to force us to rethink what the suburbs are actually designed to do and what it means to be able to say that you live there. I think that's a question that we're going to have to wrestle with. The other issue is, how do we help poor people who are now concentrating in suburbs to live there more effectively? The housing choice vouchers program is not the answer, because often landlords in middle-class communities don't accept a voucher, which means poor people are being pushed out even further to distant suburbs, even further away from mass transit. So I wonder if something like providing access to Uber to poor people is a temporary solution. The problem is that in order to have an Uber account, you have to have a credit card, and most poor people don't have access to a credit card. So what if we created a trial program where we provided poor people with a card that they could use specifically for Uber rides? Would that help to alleviate some of the difficulties that poor people face in the suburbs? It's worth a try.
And Professor Windling, what kind of policy changes would you suggest?
I mean, I would say, first of all, that problems which seemed like absolutely intractable and like not even up for discussion as little as like 10 to 15 years ago when I was in graduate school now seem to be like front page news and actually like moving so fast, like I cannot kind of keep up. And so one that I give presentations to federal officials like pretty regularly. And for example, like the Biden administration from the Department of Justice announced an anti-redlining initiative. They just announced a like set of reform efforts for real estate appraisal. And then there's also legislation that Maxine Waters in the House Financial Services Committee has recently introduced. And, like there's an ongoing set of discussions about reparations programs. And I think seeing all of this activity, one of the best things that I, as a historian, can do is simply kind of continue that education process. And I don't tell people like what, like Evanston, Illinois' reparations program, yay or nay. Like, listen, that is, like I want to see all kinds of experimentation. I want to see all kinds of advocacy and activism. And as a kind of political process, we'll see what's viable, what gains momentum, as long as it's informed by some of the best research and some of the best kind of community spirit. So, I mean, I would love to see more walkable, more diverse, more mixed income communities. How to get there? I'm only one kind of voice among many, many, many people. And so my best move may simply to make sure that we have the tools for understanding how we got where we are today.
Professor Lacey's comment about how suburbia has traditionally been a reward for people who kind of follow the charted path of society. And then I think about today's comment about the return of young people to cities, and how if living in the city becomes a reward for doing well in society, and how it seems to simultaneously open up possibilities both for gentrification in a non-ideal world, but also for a more egalitarian metropolis. If the municipal tax budgets of cities can be balanced out, if there's a range of incomes and peoples and diversities in the city centers of Detroit. That's all the questions I have for now. I'm curious if any of the speakers have any other concluding thoughts or comments before I open it for questions from our audience of people from all over the country. I recognize some of them.